the newsagents.
As Tony Blair said in a different context, a new dawn has broken, has it not? In Downing Street today, it's the changing of the guard. The palace intrigue has been sort of resolved, and some anonymous names with huge amounts of power have been shifted around in what was a bloodbath, with Keir Starmer having to intervene in the squabbling and power struggle that has racked his government so soon after coming to power.
Sue Gray, known initially to most people as the scourge of Boris Johnson during Partygate, was Keir Starmer's chief of staff. After less than 100 days in office, she is gone and replaced by his new right-hand man, Morgan McSweeney, who headed up Labour's general election campaign. Remember that Labour was supposed to end the chaos, the endless comings and goings from Downing Street, and yet here we are all over again. Why has Keir Starmer done it, and will he finally be able to use his new number 10 to get a grip on his government? Welcome to the Newsagents.
It's John.
It's Lewis.
And later in the podcast, we're going to be talking a lot about the Middle East 1 year on from the October the 7th attacks by Hamas terrorists in Israel, what it means now for the region, what happens next, and whether there are any hopes of peace. And we'll be talking to the historian and writer Simon Sebag Montefiore.
But first, we are going to talk about the convulsions in Downing Street on Sunday into Monday. Sue Gray, as we were saying there, has gone. And it was a really weird day on Sunday because I was doing my LBC show and we had heard on the Saturday night, myself and Aggie Chambray, who's the LBC political correspondent, and Natasha Clark, who's the political editor, we'd heard this rumour, actually coming from Northern Ireland via a slightly weird route, that Sue Gray had gone. All of us started to ask different people in Downing Street over the course of Saturday night, has she gone? And obviously rumours had been swirling around this for some time. And we had no answer. No answer on Saturday night, no answer on Sunday morning. By the time we go on air at 10 o'clock on Sunday, there was nothing. By that time, as you know, John, if Downing Street are ignoring you for 12 to 18 hours,
there's something going on.
You know there's something up. And it got to the point where I actually ended up asking Peter Kyle, the science secretary, will she be in by Christmas? And he sort of stopped waffled. I said, is she still in place by the end of today? And he was waffling again. So we sort of knew we sort of broke it on the show. But to take it back a little bit, Sue Gray, in case you hadn't been following it, is, as I was saying at the top, she initially became well known to the public via Partygate because she was a senior civil servant, the head of ethics for the civil service, who was asked to investigate Boris Johnson and his activities and his Downing Street's activities with regards to the breaches of lockdown rules. Slightly bizarrely, to everyone's surprise, a few months later, she gets asked by Keir Starmer to become his head of number 10. Now, she has been a lifelong career civil servant. She's never had any political affiliation or party political affiliation. But she goes to become his chief of staff with the idea that, and this is how it was trailed at the time, that Sue Gray knows Whitehall inside out and she will be able to make sure that we can drive our agenda through the civil service from day one. But pretty much from day one of her appointment, she becomes a source of intrigue. There are lots of stories about her, partly because of her role in Partygate, and I think it's fair to say the Conservative press never really forgave her for that, and certainly Boris Johnson hasn't. Lots of stories about her, and then particularly after the election, which we've covered on this show, particularly after the election, lots and lots of reports about a deep, deep tension between Gray and Morgan McSweeney, who had been the Labour Party general election chief, who had gone into Downing Street in a slightly different role, and basically Downing Street divided by factionalism right down the middle between the two of them. And we found out yesterday that there was only one winner of that battle, and it was Morgan McSweeney, because after less than 100 days, Sue Gray has gone.
But what a cost is being paid in terms of Starmer's reputation for calm management. It was going to be the end of the chaos. It was going to be orderly government. It was going to be delivery on, the goals of this government. Instead of which, not only was there a power struggle, and it's not unusual in politics for people to be jockeying for position, but immediately after the election, you got the briefing and counter briefing of senior journalists about just how toxic the environment was within Downing Street, within who has control over the policy agenda, who is getting FaceTime, I mean literally FaceTime, with the principal, i.e. Keir Starmer. Where are people sitting? These things became issues that were very real and dividing Downing Street to such an extent that you have this playing out in the public prints, and the leaking of Sue Gray's salary at £3,000 more than Keir Starmer was earning. Now, I don't think that what she was earning is the significant or interesting bit about it. It was the fact that, you know, people were prepared to do this to Sue Gray. And just on one of the delicious ironies of the kind of whole thing, and there's a lot to unpack here, is that the repositioning, the realignment of Sue Gray was delivered by Simon Case, the Cabinet Secretary. Those two had been at loggerheads for years. Simon Case is on his way out, but he has finally seen her off.
And we should say, like, this might sound, you might be sat there and thinking, oh, this is just sort of court politics, like palace intrigue, so what? It matters because, I mean, for a start, it matters on one very simple level, which is whoever is around the Prime Minister, his inner circle, that matters in terms of how he governs, because it matters in terms of the advice he's getting, the decisions he takes. So these very senior figures really matter in terms of the government overall. But it matters for another reason as well, which is that Downing Street and the Labour Party more generally have been obviously asking themselves the question that everybody else has been asking, which is, why has the government got off to such a rocky start? Now, there are lots of reasons for that, some of which we discussed on this show. But certainly there is a feeling that one of the reasons it's got off to a rocky start is that the personnel have not been right, that they haven't had the right people in the right jobs. And we can deduce from this that Keir Starmer must certainly think that, because there is no way, if he thought that his government had got off to a good start, that he would be doing this, that he would be replacing his chief of staff, his most senior aide, at profound embarrassment to himself and indeed to her as well. And this must be a very, very bruising experience for Sue Gray personally. And there's no doubt she's been the subject to an enormous amount of negative briefing, some of which I'm sure is unfair, some of it may be fair. These things are always get rather messy. But there is no doubt that Starmer must have concluded that this battle, which he is said to intensely dislike, he hates negative briefing, he hates the idea of his team being disunited. In one real sense, he has rewarded the side that is most likely responsible for that briefing, which is the McSweeney faction, by getting rid of Sue Gray.
Well, that's so interesting. And you were saying about you preparing for your Sunday show yesterday and the rumours going around on Saturday night that this had all been delivered. You know, Sue Gray obviously wasn't seen around the Labour Party conference in Liverpool,
no.
But Morgan McSweeney was there, very much present. And, you know, he was telling people, selected people, that, look, I've got to have any problem with Sue Gray. Relationship is fine. Nothing to worry about here.
If you say so, Morgan.
Yeah, if you say so, Morgan. Well, one, it was either he's lying. Two, he knew he had already seen her off. Or three, the first two combined. And I you know, it's hard to think of it in any other way that she has been seen off. She now has this demotion. And I was in Scotland this weekend, and I spent a bit of time talking to one of the SNP MPs, and he said, you know, look, all these votes went over to Labour from the SNP, and since then we've seen the winter fuel allowance, we've had Freebiegate, and now we've got this power battle where Sue Gray is demoted to some sort of colonial secretary travelling round the regions and the outposts of empire.
Her new title is Envoy for the Prime Minister to the Nations and Regions. Like she's a sort of, like Starmer's a kind of colonial governor.
So what does that mean? She's giving out little, you know, bags of something or other.
Well, it sort of was her old job in the civil service, so it's a sort of, it's a nod to that.
But the point that this MP was making to me was, it's not going to go down well that you get a demotion and come to Scotland and Wales a bit more.
Would you like to be an envoy for the Prime Minister?
I think it would be somewhere more exotic.
Yes.
The Caribbean islands.
Chagos Islands.
Chagos Islands.
Yeah. Oh, no,
I will deal with handover of the Chagos Islands. So I just do think that it's kind of, on every level, it's turned into a bit of a mess. And the other thing that's worth noting is that I think it was on last Thursday's podcast, we were talking about the deep unease over the way things were being communicated. And this was after Keir Starmer announces that he's going to give back 6,000 quid for his Taylor Swift tickets and his Doncaster racecourse outing and whatever else. And the feeling of how is this story still running? And he's also bolstered the communications shop inside Downing Street as well.
Yes, indeed. And I think in a way that is one of perhaps the more significant elements of this restructure, which is that they have got a new head of strategic communications, which rather implies the previous operation was being a bit unstrategic, a guy called James Lyons, who used to be a lobby journalist. And I think there is a feeling, I mean, that we were talking about, as you say, John, on the show last week, that communications needs to be sharpened up. It has emerged through the reporting overnight, something that astonishes me, that Sue Gray was responsible for the grid, the thing that sort of says what the government is going to announce when in its first 100 days. Now, if that is true, it may not be true, but if that is true, it's pretty extraordinary in a sense that what Sue Gray was not, in any sense, has never had anything to do with is communications, the media, journalism. She's a technocrat. By all accounts, she was a very accomplished technocrat, very accomplished civil servant throughout her career. But there is absolutely no way that for an incoming government you need someone who really understands communications. I think there is just on that point, look, I think it is very easy, and something I'll be slightly wary of, is that it is very easy in politics and in the media generally, we often get obsessed with these sort of Svengali type figures, or Rasputin type figures, whether it's Dominic Cummings, whether it's Alistair Campbell, now Sue Gray, now it'll be Morgan McSweeney. We always assume that, if you just sort of put someone in there or take someone away, that all of the problems will go away. Look, if it was true that Sue Gray was in charge of the grid, then that might be a problem. It might have been her. But there's a wider problem, which is that ultimately the direction of the government must come from the top, and it must come from the Prime Minister. And I would be sceptical of the idea that any sort of instant restructure, which everyone always assumes is going to sort of solve the problems, will solve the problems unless the drift which has basically taken place, and the torpor which has taken place since the election, is solved by an infusion of ideas, narrative and story, which ultimately has to come from Keir Starmer personally, because it is his government and he has to have a strong idea of what he wants to do. And I think something, I remember saying on this show like a year ago, which is that there was always been a concern, and we're talking to Labour advisors before that, around that time, always a concern that they had a great plan for what they wanted to do up to and including the election, but not such a great plan for what they wanted to do after the election when it came. And ultimately, Sue Gray is proving, and will prove, a convenient fall guy. I have no doubt from what people have said to me that there were clear problems there, and there was always a big question mark about why Starmer offered him the job, her the job in the first place. I mean, at the end of the day, you had quite an unpolitical Prime Minister in many ways, with a Chief of Staff who was extremely unpolitical. She was a civil servant. The truth is, I don't think he should have ever offered her that job. And to be honest, I don't think she should have ever accepted it, not least because of her role in Partygate. The net result of all of this is that Starmer didn't get a very effective Chief of Staff. Her reputation has taken quite a substantial diminishment, fairly or unfairly. And the net result is all you really get. The only thing it's really yielded is that Boris Johnson, as he was doing quite literally on Friday in an ITV interview about his book Unleashed, it has been able to say that the process which partly led to his defenestration as Prime Minister, the Partygate investigation, was somehow illegitimate. Now, I don't believe that's true. I don't believe Gray did act in that way. But come on, it didn't look great, did it, that Sue Gray ultimately was the person investigating him and 2 months later went to become Keir Starmer's Chief of Staff. This is what Johnson had to say at the weekend.
I can only give you my honest opinion of it all now, right? Who investigated this thing? Why don't you tell our viewers who investigated it?
I don't want to go down the avenue. Sue Gray.
And just to remind our viewers who Sue Gray is.
Sue Gray is a leading civil servant.
What post does she currently hold?
We're not going down this road.
Why not?
Because no one disputes the essential facts. I asked you about Martin Reynolds inviting 100 people.
I will tell our viewers what post Sue Gray currently holds.
I know everyone knows what Sue Gray does.
I'm going to tell them.
This is unfair on Sue Gray, who is not here to defend herself. You are here to defend yourself, so I'm making...
I'm so sorry. Well, let me just...
I'm asking the questions on behalf of our viewers.
She is the Chief of Staff of the leader.
We're all well aware.
So, there you have. I mean, obviously the Tory attack is Sue Gray was kind of compromised. I think what happened in Keir Starmer appointing her was that he looked at Blair's model in the lead up to the 97 election. Blair brings in Jonathan Powell, who was from the civil service. younger brother of Sir Charles Powell, who was Margaret Thatcher's foreign policy advisor, a very powerful figure within Downing Street. Jonathan Powell was nothing like as senior in the civil service as Sue Gray was, but he thought that was a good template. You need someone who understands how the machinery of government works and how we will get delivery once we get into power, because we will have somebody there who knows the way the civil service works. And that was a laudable aim. But as I think you rightly point out, she was too senior and too compromised and kind of, too divisive for a lot of people that were in there. But I do think this reflects on Keir Starmer as well. It's not just that there were a bunch of kids squabbling in the playground. If there was genuine fear of Keir Starmer as the Labour Party leader, as the Prime Minister of this country, new in power with a huge majority, then the firm fist should have banged on the table and said, stop it. He couldn't stop it. And the question is, will the squabbling stop now? Will there be a reset? Will we get a sense of narrative of what the government is about? Because you look at the winter fuel allowance as just one example of communication. Came from nowhere. No one was ready for that. Wasn't part of a wider conversation about what they were doing. And you just thought, you're creating a lot of problems for yourself.
And as we said on the show last week, a huge mistake, and again, which I suspect Gray was not, well, maybe she was partly responsible for, but it wouldn't just be her. It came from Rachel Reed's team. It would have been down to Starmer as well, not to have a summer budget, because without a summer budget, all we've had is vacuum. The government has been formless. If you talk to people around Downing Street, what they will say is that if McSweeney, who is clearly very politically skillful, is able to help Starmer exert a grip, new communications team which is able to start to actually tell a story, a narrative about the government, then in the long term, these first 100 days or so will be forgotten, that it will just be a blip. And that is true. The question is, as I say, and that they say that will speak well of Starmer for being decisive in making this change now. Much better to make this change on day 100 or nearly a day 100 rather than day 1000, right? Which is all could be true. The question, as I say, is whether or not McSweeney is able to do that, whether he can end the factionalism, and whether his political judgment, or rather his administrative judgment, which the Chief of Staff job ultimately is as good as his political judgment. Because what you've basically done is swap an arch administrator for an arch politico, or an arch wielder of kind of political power. He's never run anything before. He was briefly Starmer's Chief of Staff before, and interestingly, actually, he left that job. He said it wasn't the right fit. So it is now, there is a lot now riding, I think, on McSweeney's political judgment, and no one else to put the blame. It's down to him now. He got rid of the Labour left. He got rid of the soft left. He's done this with Starmer. He's now got rid of Sue Gray. He's been an absolute formidable political force. But now really the buck stops with him, and it all rests on his and Starmer's continued political judgment.
Coming up next, the Middle East 1 year on from the October 7th attacks.
Israeli military has declared a state of war alert and is mobilizing its forces following this morning's unprecedented rocket attacks from Gaza. Israeli officials say there are multiple injuries, some of them serious, and at least one fatality.
Groups of Palestinian militants crossed the border on motorcycles and in pickup trucks. They went straight to small border communities where they reportedly committed massacres.
There was a festival, a nature and music festival going on not far from the border that militants attacked. And so there's a fear of a number of wounded and dead as a result of that as well.
October the 7th last year was the worst day in Israel's history. It was the biggest death of Jews in a single day since the industrialized murder of Jews during the Holocaust by the Nazis. But this was nothing industrialized. This was brutal and savage, and it was an extraordinary event that unfolded. But it has given rise to even more violence, even more deaths, more civilian casualties, and widespread destruction, and a region where you think it teeters on the edge of a wider war now?
1,300 people died that day. More were taken hostage and are still being kept hostage by Hamas. And we all know the series of events which cascaded from it, which was more death, more destruction in each and every direction from the Middle East. Over 40,000 Palestinians are said to have been killed, Gazans are said to have been killed, and since the end of September alone, over 1,100 Lebanese. What is scary, I think, about this conflict, or where we are now, a year on, is that not only does it feel like we're nowhere near any kind of resolution, indeed it feels like we're further away from it than ever, with escalation in every direction to more and more countries, but also how completely normalised these figures have become. Because even by historic Middle East standards and previous wars in the Middle East, most of the time, these figures day after day, the number of deaths, let alone the numbers being wounded and maimed, they are dwarfing what has come before.
There's one other aspect of it as well that I just think is kind of deeply alarming, is that, I mean, you know, it has been intolerable for Israel to be attacked like that, and it invariably had to respond. And then it got attacked from the north by Hezbollah. It has responded. There are military experts and former prime ministers saying this is Israel's great opportunity to deal with the ring of fire around Israel that has been put in place by Iran. And militarily, maybe there is the chance now to really deal a serious blow to the influence of Iran in the region. No one is talking about what the political settlement looks like at the end of all of this. And that bit of the conversation, it just seems to me, is extraordinary, because peace is going to come about through politicians, not at the barrel of a gun, because historically that has always been the case.
Yeah, I mean, that is the thing that that you hear consistently from Israeli leaders as well, but not just Israeli leaders. You can't quite believe that after all of the bloodshed, that what you're hearing today is from every direction a sort of a series of people who are reaffirming the call to bloodshed. I mean, Israeli leaders obviously is continuing to say that, you know, we will destroy all of our enemies. But of course, we all know that it can never truly happen that you destroy every single one of your enemies. And if you do it, I mean, Israel has shown over the last year it is still a military powerhouse in all sorts of ways, but you just have to keep doing that fight every single generation. You can never, ever ultimately get security from the barrel of a gun. But likewise, you know, what was Hamas's reaction today? They said that they're looking forward to doing October the 7th all over again. And so one despairs, because you can see that despite it all and all the numbers we were just talking about, we're no further forward.
Well, we're joined in the studio now by writer, historian, broadcaster Simon Sebag Montefiore, whose epic work on the history of Jerusalem, which he published 10, 12 years ago, has just been updated to take cognizance of more recent events, is with us in the studio. And Simon, let's get to it. You know, it's a pretty bleak outlook 1 year on. Is a two-state solution in any way possible, where if you're a Jew living in Israel, you think, I don't want a Palestinian state next to me after what Hamas did last year. And if you're a Palestinian living in Gaza or the West Bank, you think, I don't trust Israel not to attack us again.
I think that's right. I think it's like almost impossible to believe it could happen right now. And that's the, you know, both sides are staggering, blood spattered in a frenzy, in a stupor of hatred. But out of these things, you know, out of the Intifada came the peace process. Out of 73 came the Egyptian peace. Peace can happen, and a lot of the people who say that, you know, two-state solution is now impossible are in fact in a sort of masked way saying that there should only be a Palestinian state and there shouldn't be a two-state solution. A lot of the argument depends on the West Bank, where terrible things are happening at the same time. On one hand, militant Jewish settlers are persecuting Palestinian farmers and citizens. On the other side, armed groups are now attacking into Israel and Jewish settlers there as well. So, you know, there is a sort of a nexus of conflict. But at the same time, there are 700,000 settlers there, Jewish settlers there, which seems an enormous number that it would be possible to remove them. But actually, over 80% of those are living in suburbs of Jerusalem, in effect. They're not exactly those kind of fanatical supremacists that you see on the news. And so that leaves a much smaller number that would need to be removed, or they could stay in a Palestinian state. Why not?
So have you found, just personally yourself, as someone who is deeply interested in this region, its history, its politics, but also, given everything that we know that's happened to the state of kind of political discourse in this country on the subject over the last year, how have you yourself found navigating the past year personally?
Really, really difficult. I mean, it's been a nightmare. The world has changed very much, and it's really difficult holding the centre. Believing as I do in two nations, two republics, as I call it. I've been attacked from both sides, but you've got to try and do the right thing. We're in a kind of frenzy, a vortex of hatreds, particularly in the campuses, in academia, but also in the social media. And you've just got to stick to what you think is right, even though there is incredible hatred out there, and people say just appalling things to me, for example, all the time. And I can't believe that people are writing this in their homes.
I mean, something I've thought about a lot over the last year is why it is that people have such charge about this particular issue, right? And I keep thinking, I mean, is there an element of it that the way our discourse works today, we like to think and we like to associate ourselves with moral absolutes, and we like to associate moral absolutes with a particular side in any particular debate. And this, we've already alluded to the sort of weight of the history. This is a conflict and a set of political issues where no side can claim to have a monopoly on moral absolutes, right? That's just impossible to say. And that, it seems to me that we find it in the way that we talk about politics these days, that almost short circuits our brains, or lots of people's brains. I think you're absolutely
right. I think you're right there. And it is a strange part of the social media discourse that we have now. But there's another thing with the Holy Land, which is a particular. I mean, yes, there are huge elements of anti-Semitism in all this, whether you call it anti-Zionism or not. But there's something else that's very interesting. Our history, our connection as the Western Christian world, and in the empires of the 19th and early 20th centuries, our history with the Holy Land has instilled in us, even unconsciously, a belief that it is our right to adjudicate, to judge, to decide the future of Jerusalem and the Holy Land in a way that applies to no other country, no other region in the world. And it is the greatest irony that those intolerant, illiberal, progressive protesters who are saying, celebrating Hamas's resistance on campuses in America and Britain, particularly, they were, and who are constantly protesting against imperialism, settler colonialism, and all this ideological stuff. Deep in their souls, buried, they would be very surprised to find that all of this comes from the Crusader and imperial and colonial past of the Western world, which is ever present, even though they would be very shocked to hear that. But that is the reason why there are these protests about the Holy Land, but not, for example, about Syria. Why the death toll in Gaza is so charged with righteous absolutes, as you put it. But there were hardly any protests about 500,000 people killed in Syria or 150,000 killed in the last 9 months in Sudan, for example, who are never mentioned anywhere by any students. So that's the reason why. There's a historical, cultural reason from our own history. And this really started with the Crusades. Of course, it started with Constantine the Great and the conversion to Christianity and the making of the Holy Land in Jerusalem into a Christian geography and in a Christian cultural journey with the building of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and so on. But really, it started with the Crusades. And it's interesting to remember that in the Middle Ages, every single church, every single village in Britain, for example, had a Jerusalem room, a Jerusalem chamber, where there were pictures of Jerusalem. It's impossible to understand what is happening today without realizing that in the Crusades, 100,000 ordinary people from England, from Germany, travelled round the Mediterranean to go and die to retake Jerusalem. And that extended all the way down to Lloyd George in the World War I, when he said, we want to take Jerusalem as as a Christmas present for the British nation. And he said, I'm more familiar with the place names in the Holy Land than I am with the place names on the Western Front. So that's one major reason why the Holy Land is so emotional and almost a religious issue today, even for people who regard themselves as the ultimate progressives.
Simon Sebag Montefiore, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I thought Simon was very interesting and very thoughtful about what he said at the end there, about the sort of historical impulses which guide our abiding interest in this region. And I think he's completely right about that. And it does go some way to explain why it is, the kind of disparity as to why we're so interested, or there is so much sort of animation about Israel, Gaza, or Israel, Palestine, by comparison to sort of other conflicts around the world. But I think it's sort of right up to a point, which is that you can be, or rather two things can be true at once. You can, of course, be guided by the kind of historical universe that you inherit, whilst also those concerns, which I thought maybe was slightly dismissive of in terms of the kind of progressive opinion about some of this on university campuses and so on, that those concerns can still, nonetheless, as guided as they might be by some of the historical impulses, be valid and legitimate. What I do think is, and I was talking to Simon Sharma about this on my LBC show yesterday, and I was asking him precisely about this moral absolutism point, which I think is absolutely present and makes it very difficult for those of us reporting on it to discuss it or to report on, because everyone always wants to take a side and claim that moral absolutism. I put that exact point to him, and he said, well, I completely agree. And he quoted a Israeli writer with a quote that I'd never heard before, but I thought which summed it up perfectly, which was, the problem with the Israel-Palestine conflict is it's a war of two rights and it's a war of two wrongs. Both sides have right, both sides have wrong, and they are both right in their respective ways. And trying to navigate that is extremely difficult. And the truth is, my feeling when I look at the Middle East now, and this is the thing that when people trade in these moral absolutes, I struggle with, is that what I see is civilian population in every country is that, for the most part, in one way or another, as hostile or as suspicious as they might be of others, nonetheless generally want to live in peace. What I see is you've got political leadership in every country who are not willing to do what would be necessary, which is to change the status quo. Because in one way or another, the status quo suits them. Not their civilian populations, but it suits them. Whether it's Netanyahu, whether it's Hamas, whether it's Iran, or whoever it happens to be, whether it's Hezbollah. And until you get a different set of leadership with a different set of attitudes who are willing to do what we all know needs to happen in the end, which is sit down and talk and hammer out a deal, nothing will ever change.
So there's a lot to pick through there. I think on the moral absolutism point, I do think there is a sort of tendency at the moment for a sort of new Puritanism, that you have to have the right line on everything or you are condemned. And Israel, Gaza, it seems black and white to a lot of people, when it's not black and white. There is right and right and there is wrong and wrong. And I think our inability as a society to hold two thoughts simultaneously is really frightening. I mean, it's really frightening to me.
It's stupid.
It's stupid.
More than anything.
So the idea that you cannot feel enormous empathy and concern for the hostages that were taken on October the 7th last year because you side with the Palestinians, or if you side, with the Israelis and you're sort of ardent Zionist, then you can't feel any sympathy for the Palestinians. I feel October the 7th last year was traumatic. And I think that what has happened since then in the prosecution of this, with so many thousands of civilians caught up in this in Gaza and killed, is equally traumatic and alarming. And the fact of the matter is, I went to, one of the times I was in Jerusalem, it was to see Blair when he was part of the quartet group, leading the quartet group, and he's trying to find kind of, some path through. And he made that point that you've just made. Everybody knows what needs to happen to get a two-state solution. But Benjamin Netanyahu made a bet bad bet that it was good for him to have Hamas as the enemy in Gaza because you couldn't have peace with them. And it suited Hamas to have Benjamin Netanyahu because Hamas want to drive Israel into the sea. And I think Netanyahu wants a one-state solution of Greater Israel. And I think it suited them both. And then, of course, October the 7th happens and Netanyahu is made to look a fool and incompetent and kind of lazy in what he has done in terms of the security of the southern border. They have been let down by their political leaders, but it's going to take someone with courage. And there has been times when progress has been made, but you've got to get away from, the politicians have let people down in Israel and Gaza.
We will be back tomorrow on Tuesday.
We'll see you then. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.